On behalf of Namita Gokhale and William Dalrymple and all my colleagues at Teamwork Arts, welcome back to JLF's Brave New World. We're proud to share with you that we've exceeded 2.8 million views on this platform, and none of this would have been possible without your involvement, participation, and appreciation. As we lead into our 100th episode next week, we would love to hear from you as to how JLF's Brave New World has impacted your worldview. Please do post your videos on contact@teamworkarts.com or via WhatsApp on +91 989 1155 107 by this weekend. And in case you missed our earlier episodes with Ian McEwan, Marcus du Sautoy, Paul Zakaria, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Neil Gaiman, Howard Jacobson, and so many others, you can watch these on our Facebook page, JLF Litfest, and on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. Our official radio partner is Red FM Bajate Raho. Our session today is China and the World. Rana Mitter in conversation with William Dalrymple. For 70 years, India has tended to look at Pakistan as its main strategic rival and potential enemy. But recent events in Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and on the line of control in Ladakh have given many pause for thought. China has a large population and economy than India, and a more modern array of weaponry equipping its army. Should India be worried? Have our strategic thinkers been looking in the wrong direction? Professor of the History and Politics of Modern China at Oxford University, Rana Mitter, British Indian China watcher and author of the new book, China's Good War, cuts through the mythology and separates truth from fiction in conversation with William Dalrymple. Rana Mitter, OBE, FBA, is director of the China Center at the University of Oxford. His book, China's War with Japan, 1937 to 45, The Struggles for Survival, was a book of the year for The Economist and Financial Times. His latest book is China's Good War, How World War II is Shaping a New Nationalism. William Dalrymple is the best-selling author of In Xanadu, City of Jinns, From the Holy Mountain, Age of Kali, White Mughal, The Last Mughal, 9 Lives, Return of a King, and Kohinoor. His new bestseller is The Anarchy, The Relentless Rise of the East India Company, and Forgotten Masters, Indian Paintings for the East India Company. William Dalrymple is also co-director of the Jaipur Literature Festival. Please do remember to comment and ask questions by typing it into the comment section. And in case any of you drop off due to bandwidth issues, you can find us on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. And of course, if any of us drop off, just hang in there and we'll be right back on Facebook. Ladies and gentlemen, China and the World. Rana Mitter in conversation with William Dalrymple.
Welcome, Rana. Very good to see you again. The JLF has become rather the Oxford Litfest over this weekend. We had your colleague Marcus du Sautoy yesterday talking to Ian McEwan, who was sitting somewhere outside in Oxfordshire. And you're sitting, I think, also in Oxford now.
I am, but then, as you know, Willie, there's always been a very long connection between Oxford and India, including, of course, the wonderful Indian Institute building, which still has words from Max Muller and some Sanskrit on the inside door. So in some senses, the link is quite natural.
And a nice elephant on the top corbel.
Even
better. Down over the Radcliffe camera.
Exactly.
So, Rana, we're going to go back even further than that, just as an introduction. I mean, obviously, what China is up to, this apparent turn in Chinese policy over the last few months, with worrying developments in Xinjiang, with the extension of the Great Firewall of China over Hong Kong and the suspension of liberties, and then this strange kerfuffle in the Himalayas with all the unanswered questions attached to that, have made many people very anxious about China's intentions, both locally, I suppose, in the Himalayas, but also across the world. And I wonder if we could just open this debate by having a look at the long history. Obviously, China and India have been the two great ancient civilizations of Asia, but in many ways quite distant. I mean, the Himalayas and the sea separating the two have made the two neighbors only sort of intermittently in contact. Is that fair to say or not over the last 3,000 years, if we take the long view?
Well, and like any good historian, William, you're an excellent historian. I'm going to answer yes and no to your question there, because I think it's fair to say that what you're pinpointing, the fact that two enormous neighbors have, relatively speaking, so little contact with each other. I mean, just to take a contemporary note for a moment, that did you know that at least until recently, and I think maybe now, there are only 4 flights a week between Beijing and New Delhi. So, compared to the number between New York and London in non-COVID times, when you have, 24 a day, it's absolutely astounding in terms of that lack of.
It is an extraordinary figure, that. Yes.
It indicates something quite profound, which we'll get back to later about the politics. But in terms of the long view, where there have been encounters, they have been of the most profound importance, and sometimes the balance has changed. And the example I'd love to use is, of course, Buddhism. Now, that is, I think, a really good place to start, if I may, if we're going to talk about the China-India connection. Because, of course, when I talk to Chinese friends, as well as Indian friends, about why actually the countries should know more about each other, I always like to point out that one of the most important influences actually in China today is a religion which, of course, originated in Bihar rather than anywhere in Shanxi or Shandong province. Shandong, of course, being the province where Confucius was born. And if we think about the fact that it was only really about 100 CE or AD, if you prefer, when Buddhism came across the Himalayas, if you want to put it that way, one way or another, and began to spread. And then it wasn't until really a couple of hundred years after that when the great Central Asian monk, but with, you might say, an Indian father, Kumarajiva, responsible for translating Sanskrit and Pali texts.
Kashmiri, Kumarajiva?
Sorry, say again?
Kashmiri or from Central Asia?
Strictly speaking, Central Asia. He came from what's now Kucha, which of course is in Xinjiang province, a place which has...
And he studied in Kashmir. He was sent off to Kashmir for studies. Yeah,
that's right. He went to, and he was brought up by his mother, as indeed, oddly enough, was Confucius. So there's something obviously about religious, geniuses being, or at least ethical geniuses. Confucius was more of that, being brought up by the female side of the parentage. Maybe there's something significant there. But of course, in terms of translating those very important Buddhist texts into what I think came out at something like 2 million Chinese characters worth of texts there. Of course, these texts are still the ones that Chinese Buddhists use. It started, or at least kick-started, a change which means that today there are millions of Buddhists in China. There are not millions of Buddhists in India. But if you wanted to find something that is both impeccably Chinese and, of course, very much Indian in origin, it is Buddhism, the religion to which hundreds and hundreds of millions of...
If we could linger there just for a minute. Thinking about this period of Wanzang, when this Chinese monk comes over, famously through Afghanistan, and he says something which today sounds extraordinary. A Chinese monk says, men of good taste regard everything from India as being of excellence, or something like that. There's a phrase that and at this period in the early Tang, you have a brief moment when India is all the rage. People look on, start using terms like Chakravartin, and the Empress Wu even sees herself as a reincarnation of the Bodhisattva Maitreya, and brings in Indian monks to expound that theology.
Look,
in other words, she's using theology to cement her rule as a woman ruler.
Well, that's absolutely right. The only thing I'd say is maybe not such a short moment, actually. I think in a sense it had quite a lasting effect. Let's just speak for a moment about the woman you've mentioned, because she's so fantastically interesting.
She's a good story. Go tell her story. Yeah.
She is amazing. She's an amazing person, incredibly vicious and ruthless, but then, so were most...
Originally just the 5th concubine of the old Tang emperor.
Yeah, but you've got to think about it as an imperial career ladder, I think, William. She started not at the bottom, but certainly at quite a lowly level at court, and she managed to strategize and murder her way to the very top position. So just to explain to perhaps people who haven't heard of Wu Zetian, or her personal name was Wu Jiao, she is the only person to have sat actually as emperor, not empress, but emperor in her own right. Because Confucian tradition in China, the tradition coming from the philosopher Confucius, does not legitimize female rulers. So that's a little different from Western Europe. Female rulers were rare, but Queen Elizabeth, Queen Mary in Britain, in England, they were rulers who were recognized in their own right.
Mary, Elizabeth, yeah.
Absolutely. The complexities, of course, of Protestant and Catholic history, but a slightly different track there, of course. But in terms of China, a woman actually holding the position at the top in her own right, as opposed to a sort of power behind the curtain. That was not allowed, and Wu Zetian was the only person to manage to do it. So, having done that, and actually,
the previous empress, her rival, ended up with her hands and feet cut off and drowned in a barrel of wine in mysterious circumstances.
That happened to a couple of people, and also various sort of male heirs mysteriously found themselves sort of suddenly dead when they turned up. Unfortunately, that doesn't fit the full story. But anyone who has time, please do go to my my podcast, BBC podcast called Chinese Characters, where I have 15 minutes on the Empress or Emperor Wu Zetian and her rise to the.
That straight away afterwards.
Absolutely. Well, it's a bloody tale, but a very, very interesting one. But the point is, she was actually a really good emperor. All the records say that, the Tang dynasty sort of expanded gently under her rule. People, about 65 million people in the Chinese emperor at that stage. Big, in medieval times, that's a huge empire. Very well run, extremely competent. And one of the things that really she decided to push was Buddhism. There was Buddhism around during the dynasty, but she basically, as you've said, brought in many monks, religious practices. This was actually used against her afterwards. Oh, she's bringing in these weird foreigners and all these strange, mysterious goings on. She didn't care from the sound of it. She was enjoying herself. And actually, of course, in some ways, for the most anomalous emperor, a woman who was regarded in some ways as outside the mainstream, to do things with a religion which had come from outside became more natural from that point of view. So in that sense, the Indian nature of Buddhism, you might say, was quite symbolic as wanting to do something different from the norm.
And Buddhism, in this sense, as far as she was concerned, was something egalitarian, which allowed a woman to rule and allowed her to distance the Confucian officials who were complaining that a woman was taking over.
It did. I think it allowed her more legitimacy for her own path, because, of course, when she did die, the Confucian officials got, in the short term, the last laugh. They set up a tomb for her, which you can still go to and see outside the city of Xi'an. It's completely blank. There is no carving of, extensive writings on it. But of course, I would say that Wu Zetian got the very last laugh, because these days, Chinese television runs literally, 70-part soap operas on her life. One of China's most famous, what one put it, socialites, I think is the word we must use in the present day, has become known as the new Wu Zetian, partly because of her rather, I don't know if she's a Buddhist, she probably isn't, but she certainly has a somewhat unorthodox lifestyle. So the legend of Wu Zetian, this amazing Buddhist emperor, female emperor of the Tang dynasty, still very much alive in Chinese imagination today, not forgotten at all.
Then moving forward, you have a period when India's influence contracts, in a sense, when you have all the Turkic invasions during the 12th century, and China expands. You have the famous admiral who I'm going to mispronounce. What's he called? The Gung He, but written completely differently, just to muddle us. Yeah.
Depending on how you read it. That's right.
Gung He, and he goes to Gaul and circles India. And Gaul in Sri Lanka. So that period, India's, in a sense, the period of Indian influence is diminishing. Then you get colonization, and both India and China find themselves at the boot end of the East India Company, growing opium in India to sell in China. But at the end of this, towards the end of this period, let's move now to your most recent book, World War II. What's going on between India and China at this period? The end of the British Empire.
Well, one of the great, in my opinion, unknown stories about not just World War II, a period which certainly, viewers in the West, I know that one of the wonderful things about the necessity of this lockdown version of JLF, Willie, is that we have viewers possibly from around the world on this, although many I know are, of course, in India. But I think viewers in the West, World War II is one of those stories that they think they know. And actually, there's all sorts of really interesting elements that just don't seem to come into the mainstream story. So I want to just briefly bring one up today that may be new even to our viewers in India, and I hope possibly even China as well, where JLF's name should be spread even more wide than it is now. So the story I just want to tell is something that happened February 1942. And any student of Indian history will know that later in that year, you get the Quit India movement. It's a big moment for Indian nationalism. But what isn't remembered so well is that there was a Chinese connection earlier in the year, which was the visit of the then Chinese nationalist leader, Chiang Kai-Shek. And this was a man who had fought, literally on horseback for much of the 1920s and 30s to really painfully reunify China. And then in 1937, China was invaded by the Japanese, and World War II in Asia began, in fact, 2 years before the 1939 outbreak of war in Europe. And China was essentially fighting pretty much alone during the first 4 years, 1937 to 41, although, amongst other things,
do the Chinese look on this as part of the century of humiliation as much as the Western intrusions?
Well, that Chinese phrase, the century of humiliation, I mean, really that period from the Opium Wars of 1842 to the end of World War II in 1943, absolutely points out the way that the Chinese feel, even to this day. They've been repeatedly invaded from outside. But you could argue that the World War II period is when the century of humiliation starts to turn instead to a much more victorious sort of period. So when the all-out war in Asia broke out after Pearl Harbor, Chiang Kai-Shek, as the Chinese leader, thought that what he would contribute, and understandably, was to go to India and to visit the two great nationalist leaders, to visit Nehru and to visit Gandhi. And his aim was actually a very commendable one, which is to try and persuade them to abandon the position they had taken that India shouldn't be in the war because Lord Linlithgow, the Viceroy, had
declared war without asking permission.
Without passing permission of the Congress Party, and this was understandably they were pretty angry at this. And Chiang said to them, and again, one of the things that was a great pleasure for me was reading Chiang Kai-shek's diary, still unfortunately only available in Chinese, but available to scholars at the Hoover Institution. And he writes a lot about this in his diaries. And he says he admires Nehru and Gandhi so much as nationalist leaders. He wants to create a new sort of Asian alliance. He does a broadcast at the end, saying India must be given independence. But his basic message didn't get through. The message was to both Gandhi and Nehru, look, you should come in on the side of the British. You should fight with us, including China as well. It will be a war for the liberation of Asia. And for reasons that I think our Indian viewers will know, the Nehru-Gandhi Congress Party decided that they would not come in quite the way that Chiang had wanted. The irony, though, is that none other than Winston Churchill was really angry with Chiang Kai-shek for even talking to Gandhi and Nehru. And of course, he was actually very misguided, because what Chiang was trying to do was to get people on Churchill's side. But Churchill, when it came to India, he was a great man, but when it came to India, he quite often did miss the plot, it has to be said.
Particularly in Bengal in 1942, was the greatest example of...
With the famine coming, absolutely. Yeah.
So, but there is now a major supply route going from India into the back end of China over the hump. A lot of Chiang Kai-shek's resources are coming from India. So, is there a beginning of a relationship now between Chiang Kai-shek and independent India or 1947? What's going on in Nehru?
Absolutely, no doubt about that. One of the things, again, that tends to be forgotten is that before Nehru and Mao, who we'll get to, I'm sure, shortly, became friends and then enemies, Nehru and Chiang Kai-shek were actually very close. And Nehru was a big supporter of China gaining its own autonomy, and Chiang was a huge supporter of independence for India. So they shared the same agenda. And in fact, you could say that the war in China was ultimately won on Indian backs, because the training for many Chinese troops was in a place in Bihar called Ramgarh, where actually tens of thousands of Chinese troops were shipped in after the fall of Burma. And they were trained mostly by Americans, in fact, but very much on Indian soil. Trained, equipped, and then sent back into the jungles of Burma.
On foot? Or how did they get there? Or were they flown over? Or what happened?
They were flown over. There's a wonderful memoir by a young man called Huang Yaowu, he basically signed up lying about his age. He was 16 years old. He read a wonderful memoir in Chinese a few years ago. And he was flown into India, and then from India into Burma, to basically be part of that expeditionary force. People remember the Burma campaign of that time as being British troops, Indian troops, Australian troops, and American troops. And they forget the Chinese troops who were there as well. And many of those troops were flown in from India, from Ramgarh. So actually the Indian role in China's ultimate part in victory was very real, but has tended to be brushed away because, of course, the Communist Revolution, which came later in 1949, rather put that bit of history with Chiang Kai-shek into the shadows.
So did Mao regard Nehru as Chiang Kai-shek's friend? Was that one of the reasons that Mao and Nehru came to blows?
I don't think that was the original reason, although you'd be quite reasonable to think that that might be part of it. I think that essentially Mao regarded, you might say, the rivalry between independent India and post-revolutionary China, post-1949 communist China, really had its seeds very early on, because essentially both leaders, Nehru and Mao, regarded themselves as aspirant leaders of Asia. they were both people who regarded that, they were free countries. They were going to lead this non-Western bloc or idea. And actually, Nehru, of course, as we know, had these ideas about cooperation, about peaceful coexistence, about basically calling it the non-aligned movement, of course, as it became.
Indi, Chini, bye-bye and all that stuff.
Bye-bye, all of that. Whereas, of course, Mao wanted something very different. He wanted a genuinely revolutionary communist wave to sweep through Asia and basically take over. So at some level, even though the two sides were friendly, there's a wonderful book by the scholar Arnab Ghosh at Harvard, just published, called Making It Count, which is about something that sounds as if it might be rather niche, but actually is fascinating, which was Indian and Chinese statisticians working together in that first decade of the 1950s, because they were swapping all sorts of information on agriculture and how you make national economies grow. And so the communist Chinese and the newly independent Indians actually thought they had a lot to learn from each other in that first decade of the 1950s. And it was quite a fruitful relationship, even though one country was socialist but democratic and one was communist, before, of course, things went wrong famously in 1962.
So just before 1962, let's have the arrival of the Dalai Lama.
Yes.
So what date is that?
So that is 1959, and that is a moment, obviously, that continues to this day to shape the relationship between the two countries. So Tibet, which had always had strong Chinese influence, but had essentially been pretty much autonomous through much of the early 20th century, was essentially retaken by the Chinese communist troops in 1950, just a year or so after the revolution on the mainland. And for about a decade, there was a very uneasy relationship. The Chinese were there, very much in control. They, of course, claimed then and would claim now that they never actually lost control. It just had become loosened in the early 20th century. But the Dalai Lama was able just about to live with it. But then essentially uprisings and other protests made the Dalai Lama feel that, or his followers as well, feel that he might not, be around too long, or he might disappear into a prison if he stayed there. So he basically escaped into India.
And the whole of Lhasa surrounds his palace, and he then escapes, surrounded by monks.
Yes, exactly. This sort of train of people make their way across into India, ultimately to Dharamsala, where, of course, that community in exile still exists today. And that, of course, became a point of huge contention between China and India, because China regarded this as essentially a political opponent of the Chinese government being given shelter by the Indians, and the Indians regarded, of course, as a huge oppression of a figure who they greatly admired and to whom they were giving shelter. So there was a complete separation of viewpoints on that question.
Was that the thing that led directly to the 1962 war?
Not as such, although I think it fueled the dispute, it has to be said. Essentially, the 1962 war was a border war. So, and again, there's a sort of very contemporary echo to this, in which both sides, to this day, I think, maintained that they were right. But essentially, it was about that still very unresolved line of control in the Himalayas, which, of course, is not marked by any kind of neat river or mountain or something that can actually make that division point clear. And the kind of what the Chinese called moca, which is friction between the two sides, had been bubbling up certainly for years in the 1950s. But 1962 marks the moment when, in the Chinese view, the Indians finally moved across the line of control, and the Chinese wanted basically to push back really, really hard to indicate that there was no way they would allow this. Feeling on their part, of course, very vulnerable, because we might remember that 1962 is the very last year in China of an appalling event, the Great Leap Forward, this supposed economic experiment, which actually ended up starving to death tens of millions of Chinese because of domestic policies pursued by the party. So they were feeling very vulnerable, and anything happening from outside, they saw at that moment as an attempt to push the regime finally over the edge. And that's one thing that I think...
Were there any incidents like we had this summer leading up to 1962? Were the border guards scuffling in high Himalayan passes and things, or is it not feel like that?
There were always some scuffles between the two sides, but up to 1962, I think it's fair to say that both sides, and I think the Indian side certainly expected that these were, passing squalls. These were not necessarily indications of a fundamental problem with what was going on at the place. After 1962, on the Indian side, I mean, as you know, anyone who knows any history in India will tell you that 62 remains this huge scar on military memory. And I've talked to many veterans of Indian forces who talk about it to this day. It's worth noting the Chinese don't really see it that way. It is, of course, known about by specialists in China, but 1962 is not a date that has huge resonance, partly because, of course, the number of deaths, into the thousands was tragic. But compared to some of the devastation that China has caused to itself during that period, the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward, this was actually a really relatively small border dispute as existential.
To a certain extent is true in India too, because, India is constantly facing Pakistan as its enemy. And all the troops, all the movies, all the rhetoric, all the political action is about scuffles with Pakistan and the ups and downs of that relationship. And you get the impression that the Indian army is far more focused, and Indian strategy is far more focused on that border. I'm enjoying your cat walking in. This is a nice addition.
The joy of lockdown festivals and other things. Maddie the cat has decided that she wants to blackmail me into feeding her, which is not going to happen until well after this discussion is over. But then after all, we know that many of the great Mughal figures, I think, had cats going around in their courtyards. So hopefully we can try and get some of that glamour with Maddie around here. Anyway, sorry, but
So the India after 62, despite that war, is still fixated overwhelmingly with its western border facing Pakistan, and the impression you get is that people don't really notice the rearmament, the growth of the economy in Pakistan, this extraordinary change that you see between 1990 and the present day, when Pakistan transforms from bicycles and starvation to this world superpower, to the number 2 economy in the world, to Belt and Road.
In China there, Willie, not Pakistan.
Sorry. So China transforms.
Pakistan may yet be the next, who knows, that may be on the route too, and of course, yeah.
I don't think that's quite so likely. But sorry, China transforms into the world's number 2 economy, and India is still facing its small neighbor Pakistan as if nothing has changed. Is that a fair summary or not?
I think you put some of the dynamics, very, very clearly there, Willie. I mean, it's worth saying, actually, of course, that one of the other issues that was relevant both in 1962 and after that and today is the fact that, of course, Pakistan and China have an extremely close relationship. And while China doesn't do formal alliances with pretty much anyone except North Korea, which has its own problems, of course, it would certainly regard Pakistan as one of the 2 or 3 closest partnerships that it has geopolitically. And of course, it's now putting a lot of money into the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, the Karakoram Highway, and so forth. So one should.
I went up the Karakoram Highway again 2 years ago, and you see what looks like Chinese cantonments with what looks like PLA guards, or certainly armed Chinese guards, and rather like James Bond films, these Chinese workmen all in identical outfits, sort of busy building facilities of unspecified nature up and down the highway. I mean, if you were an Indian hawk, could you say that China has bought Pakistan?
Well, two things to say on that, Willie. The first is that if you go back up there and take your mobile phone and you get excellent reception, you'll know exactly what it was that those workmen were probably doing. But the second thing is to say, actually, I put it the other way around. I mean, it's not my position to speak for or against any particular country. I don't represent anyone other than, I hope, historical research. But I think one question which certainly Pakistanis would ask is, if China is not offering us money to build 5G or to build roads or power stations or the Gwadar port, who else is there out there who's going to pay for that for us? The Americans going to do it. I think our friends in India are not going to do that. And China, in a sense, is answering a call that's been made by not just Pakistan, but by many countries around the world. If the rest of the world wants to push back against what China's doing in terms of its Belt and Road Initiative, and there are good reasons, for reasons of security, to say that actually we should keep a close and cautious eye on what China's doing and say, where our red lines are, then we have to offer other countries in the middle an alternative as well, because actually an awful lot of the economic growth that has happened in Pakistan in recent years has been through to Chinese investment. So I wouldn't talk about it as China buying Pakistan. I'd say actually Pakistan is in the market to be supported, and it's up to the rest of the world to also say what they can offer as an alternative. But your first part of your question about not noticing what had happened, sometimes it appears that appears to be the case. Now, I hope in the Q&A we'll have lots of very, very kind of lively people watching India who say, no, we knew exactly what was happening. And there are places, I'll name, if I may, the Institute for Chinese Studies in New Delhi, with great scholars like Professor Alka Acharya and many others, too many to name, if I may. But they have been looking at and understanding these issues for many decades. But I think it's fair to say that coming to terms with the rapidity of the rise of China, the fact that it's moved from, as you say, bicycles in the streets just 25, 30 years ago, to being essentially one of 2 or 3 of the only real technological innovation superpowers in the world. That is a major change. That is a major move. And it's one, I mean, the line I sometimes use, and perhaps you might want to take me up on this, Willie, or violently disagree, is that these days it seems as if India thinks about China with fear, and China really thinks about India only with a certain amount of, I would say, a spectrum that goes from affection to exasperation.
But also condescension, or not?
Yes and no. I think actually there's more respect for India in certain ways than is sometimes realized in India itself on the Chinese part. First of all, for the history. I mean, we've talked about Buddhism before, and actually, whenever I ask Chinese friends often, when you think of India, what do you think of? The Buddha, and in Buddhism actually is very much part of that mix. And there is a recognition also of the independence struggle. Nehru, or Nehru, is a admired character. But I think in general at the moment, there is in the end the battle of the numbers, you might say. So authoritarian China, $10,000 per capita GDP. Democratic India, 4,500. Autocratic India, literacy rate, including women, 95%. India, moment, hovering, I think, about 75%. So this is basically the way in which, the
Say
Chinese...
that again, Rana. Again, you did what I did. You muddled, you said it in Indian.
Sorry, yes, the other way.
Autocratic China.
Yeah, literacy rate, sorry, of 95%. And democratic India, I think it was somewhere around 75%. And also probably more gender balanced in China from all accounts, women as well as men being equally literate in that sense.
And in terms of military might, and military modernization, what's the balance?
My sense is that we're talking about just completely different leagues, Willie. I mean, China is currently the second biggest military in the world after the United States. I mean, to be fair, the United States is still the biggest by miles. We're talking about an annual expenditure of $600 billion for America, and we're talking about 170, 180 billion for China. But China is so far mostly in the Asia Pacific, but of course more and more projecting power into the Indian Ocean, which is of more direct relevance to India. So my sense is that having been a country which geopolitically, and this is rather admirable in some ways, India has not sought to project its power in a coercive way, certainly not across the globe. It's looked more to soft power, Bollywood and so forth. My sense is that now there's more discussion again of that slightly sort of lukewarm idea of the Quad. In other words, that the US, India, Japan, and Australia might be getting their naval resources together to think about, is that a way to basically confront China, or at least to try and deal with the growing sense.
We mentioned Gauda before. Do you just want to say, because I think many Indians don't know about it, the whole notion of the string of pearls? What's going on, the surrounding of India with these deep water ports in Trinco and Gauda? Again, should India be worried? Are the big Chinese battle bases primed to be turned against India?
Well, basically, at the moment, I mean, this term string of pearls has been used to basically describe increasing Chinese financial and security influence in countries surrounding India. So that would be Pakistan, Bangladesh, and others. Also, Southeast Asia.
Burma too, yeah.
Myanmar and Thailand would, to some extent, be amongst those. But actually, I'd say that one of the most interesting ways to think about this, to move on a little bit from the string of pearls and look at the Indian Ocean, because I want to add in one place that we haven't yet mentioned. That's Djibouti, very small state in the Horn of Africa, where China has its first overseas naval base. Now, there is nothing, let's add this, there is nothing inherently sinister about that, because Japan has a base there too. The United States does also. Lots of people have a little stake in Djibouti. But what it does is to give one point on the African side of the Indian Ocean, which can then potentially link up, first of all, in terms of trade, with Gwadar, this major new port which is being built on the coast of Pakistan, essentially with Chinese.
Just so we understand what we're talking about here, I mean, these are Chinese naval bases with military. I mean, for example, are the Pakistani army allowed into into Guarda or not?
Well, let's separate things out because we must be accurate. First of all, Guarda is a civilian port, as far as I'm aware. If we have, there are all sorts of rumors that it may have dual-use military capability, or another port may be built nearby. But right now, Guarda is, for the most part, from what we understand, a container port which is there for the Belt and Road Initiative. In other words, stuff being shipped from the Horn of Africa across the Indian Ocean, then come in at Guarda, and they'll make their way through the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor into Central Asia and elsewhere without having to worry about bypassing through.
So not Chinese nuclear submarines and stuff in Guarda.
At the moment, we do need evidence on this, and right now the evidence that this is militarized is not there, unlike the South China Sea, where there is much more evidence. It's more about the potential. Djibouti is specifically a military post, that is naval, but that is perfectly openly acknowledged, and I say it's part of a set of naval establishments.
Does India have a counterpart? Can we imagine Indian deep water ports anywhere else?
That is a very good question. And I think one of the things that we don't yet know, although there seems to be a lot more discussion about it now, is how far and how fast India would actually like to expand its presence within the Indian Ocean. I mean, one area that you might want to talk about in this context is the Maldives, a country which, has traditionally been under broadly Indian influence. It became under quite heavy Chinese political influence recently. But the feeling is that I think last year's general election pushed it more back in the Indian direction. But the point is the geopolitics is being played out in many of these small places, which previously were not thought of as really anyone's control. Now China and India, I think, have more of a kind of oceanic great game, something you'd know more about than me, of course, Willie, to play. And it's only just beginning. We're at the start of this, not the end of it.
And does India have, I mean, to put it bluntly, does India have a chance of catching up? Are we... in economic and military terms, China does seem, 20 years ahead or not?
India has the chance to catch up because it has all sorts of things on its side. It has, one hopes still a relatively democratic culture, and it's very important to make sure that that maintains, which means you can get consensus behind a policy if you have the right sort of policy. It has, of course, a relatively young population, which if they can get properly educated, the knowledge economy could bring it forward and help to increase that too. It's slowly but surely, I think, coming into the world trading system, although, of course, the joke is basically that doing business in China is very easy, but you may be arrested afterwards because you turn out you've broken the 6,000 laws without knowing it. In India, the red tape means you'll never get to actually break the law in the first place. And that question of whether or not India is able to actually unleash its economic advantages is a debate that, it's been going on for 25 years or more, ever since Narasimha Rao's reforms. And, Prime Minister Modi's talk about opening up India's economy has been exciting to many people, but the reality is still a long way behind. India is not a China in the making at the moment.
Retrospective taxes to Vodafone and so on have put off other companies.
Whatever it might be. China is not always the world's easiest business environment, but to be fair, if you can, as the Chinese put it, xiahai, which means literally jumping into the sea, if you can get into the entrepreneurial side of things, then you can make a lot of money and expand. And the fact that China has companies like Huawei, Alibaba, Tencent, and really, although there are great Indian
TikTok.
Infosys, TikTok, absolutely, just banned in India, of course. But, there are companies like Infosys and others that, operate in some of that space in India. But let's be honest, we're not talking about an exact comparison at the moment.
So we're running out of time and we have got questions. But so just, in a sense, to bring it all together, we've seen the Uyghurs being rounded up into camps, women having their hair shaved and sold as wigs. We've seen Hong Kong have its liberties restricted and the Great Firewall extend over it. The same year, we've seen the scuffles in the Himalayas and road building programs in back of Bhutan and Arunachal. Yeah. Just the final and most important question, should we be worried? Is China turning aggressive? Is all this preparation of Belt and Road and strings of pearls now leading to a new phase of Chinese assertiveness?
I think China is becoming more assertive. Again, on all these things, we have to be careful and nuanced, because I think there are many things, including what's happening in Hong Kong and so forth, as you mentioned, that we really need to say, look, this does not accord with, for instance, the joint declaration signed in 1984 between the British and the Chinese. But there is a difference.
And which the British have done nothing to defend. They've just sat there smiling happily as China has won.
Well, to be absolutely fair, Willie, I know, what everyone thinks of the current government, there'll be different views. They've offered up to 3 million Hong Kong residents British national passports and residence rights in the UK with a path to citizenship. And actually, to be fair, that's a more generous gesture than many expected them to make. So one should give full credit for that. But in general, general, you're right that it's fair to say that, Hong Kong hasn't been front of British minds. But getting back to the question again of what we should expect from China, it is worth noting at the moment, the areas where China is being most assertive, and it's being very assertive and confrontational, are to do with areas that it considers to be its own backyard. So Taiwan, Xinjiang, Hong Kong. Now, the rest of the world can take a different view, and I think it's perfectly legitimate to tell China when we don't like what's going on there. But that is a different issue from basically what happens in the Middle East or in South Asia and elsewhere. And so far, it might change, but so far, I don't think you can definitively show that in South Asia, in the Indian Ocean, what's happening with China is the first phase of a new plan to try and invade the rest of the world. I mean, that leads to a sort of heightening of hysteria, some of which I see in Washington, D.C. right now, which I do find very disturbing, the kind of language of potential new Cold War. We have to absolutely call out China on, human rights and territorial issues, including South China Sea, where we think they're getting it very wrong. But we mustn't lump everything into one big monolithic explanation, because then the Chinese will not respect what we have to say and respond as we want them to do.
So we must move on to audience questions now. And the first one is a very good question from Ria, saying, do you believe China's sensitivity towards their territories has a lot to do with the years of trauma, with the century of humiliation and the Opium Wars and so on?
I think, Ria, thanks for a great question. It absolutely has everything to do with that. India can understand this, I think, as a country that was colonized, as written about wonderfully in your books, Willie, for more than 200 years. But I think it's fair to say that, in a sense, China, in some ways, almost had it worse in some ways, because rather than having one defined enemy to, or not enemy, perhaps what you say, opponent, perhaps is the better way to think of the British in India, since they remain greatly beloved now that they've, of course, relinquished control. But the Chinese, of course, are coping with the British. The British turn up and start selling opium. The French come and help burn down the Summer Palace. The Japanese turn up and steal bits of Manchuria. The Russians, everyone's basically taking chunks out of China. And the expression of the time that China was being sliced up like a melon was very, very hard felt. That's one of the reasons why, and you kindly mentioned my new book, China's Good War, which will be available in India very, very shortly. In fact, I'm glad to say, is about China basically using its own social memory of the Second World War as a time when it fought the Japanese and finally won against a foreign power. That was really important to them, because being invaded the whole time and always losing was a huge trauma. Winning against the Japanese in 1945 was a big deal, which is still remembered very, very positively today. And it did something.
In the same way the Pakistan wars are important in India.
I would say that in a sense that kind of exactly social memory is very important in the same sort of way. It does a sort of psychological morale lifting. But that memory in China of the century of humiliation still very much there today, and important in understanding why China is so often so defensive and so confrontational. It doesn't mean we should excuse it. It does mean we should use history to interpret it and then be able to speak back about it.
We have a question from Nilanjana, who says, what sparked your interest in Chinese history? Here, you, a nice Indian boy, getting all interested in China. What happened?
Well, thanks very much. And I've often thought about this question myself on many occasions. I think actually, if I may, I have to give tribute on this to my parents, my father and my late mother.
Parta, the famous art historian Parta Mitter, whose books on Indian history, everyone should read.
That's what he tells me. I don't believe a word of it. But no, of course, yes, he's a very distinguished scholar. My mother was also actually a very distinguished economist who taught me a huge amount. The thing that I think was important, that only in retrospect I think Ted came to understand, was that they were always very keen to encourage me and my sister to explore things that weren't necessarily what we should obviously do, part of the mainstream of what we came to understand. So they wanted us to know about India and, of course, about Britain, where we grew up. But I think that they sparked the interest, not in China specifically, but the idea that we should try and explore things that were maybe outside our area of interest. And when I started studying China in the late 1980s and Chinese language, very few people in Britain or elsewhere actually wanted to do it. I think there were 6 people on our degree course, the BA course, when I did it. There's more than that now, but it was a very minority pursuit. But I've never regretted a moment of it nearly 3 decades later.
And looking forward now, what do you think India's response should be to these border incursions? Using your knowledge of both countries, what would you advise the government to? How would you react if people were coming towards you with barbed wire clubs and beating up your Jawans on the border?
Absolutely. I think there need to be two things that are done. The first one is that I think India does need to think about its alliances and actually working out whether or not working with other democratic states is an important thing, not to have a war with China, which of course would be ludicrous for both sides, but just to have a clearer understanding of where the red lines are on these issues. The confusion, I think, is part of the problem. The other element, though, is that India, I think, is going to have to do more, as we are in Britain and in the United States, to actually really get more knowledge on China, more people who speak the language, more people who understand its politics, and if I may say so, its history, because China as a global power is not going anywhere. It's going to be a big economic, political, security, and cultural actor for decades to come. And if we don't understand where the Chinese side is coming from, we don't have the material and the tools to be able to say, X, Y, and Z, we like this, and we'll certainly deal with you on this. And A, B, and C, we don't like that. And that's where we're going to have to come back at you. We need to be able to speak to them in a frank, friendly, and confident manner. And that is one of the things that India, I think, can do in terms of tooling itself to be able to cope with the rise of China, as India itself, no doubt, also comes to rise in the near future.
I recently had the privilege of addressing the Indian Eastern Command of the Army in Fort William in Calcutta. If you had been in my place, these are the people presumably who will have to take on the Chinese if they were to come over the border. What would your advice be to them on military front? Should they be rearming fast, getting stealth bombers? And what would be your advice to the army be?
My advice would actually be one that they may actually already encountered from the great Chinese military strategist Sun Tzu, the author of Bing Fa, the Art of War. And the most central lesson from Bing Fa, the Art of War, is the best general is the one who works out how to avoid fighting in the first place. If the strategizing, if the thinking can be done to make sure that actually India and China never have to fight again, that is the real victory.
From Parajita, she says, how do you see China's equation with the world right now, especially after coronavirus? Because again, there's been a lot of talk about China taking advantage of corona to reassert itself. Is that a good analysis? Would you go with that?
It's a sharp analysis, but I'd say that actually it's changing almost by the day as well, because I'd say that to summarize it, what has happened in the last few months is that at home, Xi Jinping's China has become actually, I think, probably more consolidated. They've taken advantage of the pandemic to use technology to control the virus, but also to give the general population, actually, I think, quite genuinely held belief that China's done pretty well in controlling the disease. So at home, I think the leadership's position is quite safe in that sense. Internationally, I think that it's been quite damaging. The initial period in which it looked as if China was going to be able to, use it, I think, to push its advantage in the world, is receiving a lot of very heavy resistance because of the so-called wolf warrior diplomacy, this very confrontational language that's being used about China has nothing to answer for, the rest of the world needs to kind of get with the program or be quiet. And this is causing anger even amongst some of the countries, places that had quite decent relations with China over the years, the Canadas and the Germanys and so forth. So I think that China, I see already by looking at, the Chinese voices that I see in the last few days and weeks, there are sensible voices even within China's foreign policy establishment who are saying to their own leaders, look, we need to calm down a bit. This is going too far, and we need to rethink why what we're doing is damaging our reputation so much in the world. So
where has that wolf warrior language been coming from? Has it been coming from the president himself? Is he a particularly aggressive character?
It's coming, I think, largely from people within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs who actually are looking more than to carry out a diplomatic aim to basically get their social media platforms getting as many kind of hits as possible. Every time one of the foreign ministry spokespeople like Zhao Lijian says something very, very confrontational, he'll get like 500,000 people saying fantastic on Weibo, the Chinese equivalent of Twitter. And I think the fact that so much foreign policy publicly has been actually focused at stoking nationalism at home rather than doing diplomacy abroad, that is part of the problem.
So is our beloved Prime Minister's TikTok diplomacy a suitable response to this social media war?
I'm not a huge fan of banning things, I have to say, Willie. And I think if there are security issues in many of these things, then you can do things with software to try and make sure that they get protected. And I've seen work on TikTok in particular that suggests that certain fixes can stop it from being, at its worst, a very, very leaky and problematic app in terms of leaking your data, to one that can be more secure. I think in the end, though, the question comes up more: why is it that China is in a position to produce all this technology that the rest of the world wants? If Huawei, TikTok, all of these various things were not so popular or producing such high quality material, then the rest of the world would have less of a problem. So I think getting to the root question, of which India should have some really interesting answers as an innovation society, could be an important next development.
Rana Mitter, thank you very much indeed. Most fantastic session. Amazing, wonderful, great spread of knowledge over 3,000 years. Fantastic.
It's a pleasure to be here with you, William. Always pleasure to be at your wonderful JLF.
Thank you, Rana. Thank you.
Thank you, Rana. Thank you, William. That was absolutely incredible. And Rana, you're absolutely right. There aren't enough Chinese experts in India, barring former foreign secretaries or ambassadors. Barring that,
your son a black belt, Sanjoy? Hasn't he just taken on the Chinese?
But he's more Filipino, whatever, knife throwing technique more than anything else. So we can't put him in.
That sounds useful too.
We do need much more to understand why it's so important. Why China feels space is so vital and important. But thank you both for that brilliant conversation and such huge insights. And thank you all for being such a wonderful audience. And of course, our official radio partners, Red FM, Bajate Raho. We hope you enjoyed the conversation and will log back at 8:30 p.m. for our next session, Textiles, the Fabric of Memory, Ritu Kumar and Himanshu Vardhan in conversation with Supriya Dravid, a session evoking textile narratives, the stories they tell, and the memories they hold with celebrated designer Ritu Kumar and Managing Director of Etsy India, Himanshu Vardhan. This is at 8:30 p.m. at Indian Standard Time, presented by Etsy. See you soon.